much, and thanks to Ashoka and Open Society Fund for getting me here. It was a bit of a challenge. I have to tell you, it should demonstrate to you how much I wanted to be here. That, let's see, today is Monday, right? That on Friday night, a tree fell on my house, and I'm still here. There was a big windstorm where I lived, and a tree fell on my house, and then my luggage was lost somewhere along the line getting here. But I'm here, and I'm very, very glad to be here. And I know that I've never, in my long career, spoken at a podium with the United States government seal on it. I think I should get a picture of this and tweet it to Donald Trump. Anyway, thanks for having me. I am here to talk primarily about solutions journalism as a new paradigm, for particularly as I think about it, for investigative journalism. But I'm also happy to speak with all of you. I know there are many accomplished journalists in the audience, and I'm as interested in your perspectives on journalism today as you might be in mine. And I guess I'll emphasize with the American flag here in front of me and the U.S. seal. The last thing, please don't look at me as one of those ugly Americans who comes and tells you how to do things. Certainly, this is where we all are. There's some tremendous commonalities in the profession of journalism and what's happening to journalism and frankly, even with government around the world. But there are some peculiarities, certainly in markets and so on. I'll talk to you a little bit about how and why I got involved in solutions journalism about 5 years ago. For most of my career, and unfortunately I don't speak or understand Czech, so I'm not exactly sure what Lucy said about me, but I was a journalist for more than 3 decades, and I was the editor-in-chief of the Seattle Times, which is one of the most respected newspapers in America, and a winner of now 10 Pulitzer Prizes, which is a large number for a regional newspaper, and many of those were won when I was the investigations editor there or the editor-in-chief. And so the people from the Solutions Journalism Network, which is a nonprofit based in New York that's really promoting this approach to journalism, they actually sought me out. I think they looked around the country and said, all right, who would be the biggest skeptic of this approach? Let's go see David Boardman. So let's see if this works, yeah. My background, again, is I'm not somebody you would think of as a softie, who was going to like happy news and good news and not a serious approach to journalism, quite the opposite. And really briefly, I'm just going to review a few of the stories that I was fortunate enough to work on in my career, just to try to win a little street cred with you before I start talking about this approach to journalism. So among those stories, we exposed a United States senator who had been a member of President Carter's cabinet and then went on to represent Washington State in the United States Senate. We exposed him as a serial sex predator who drugged and raped women. We revealed serious design flaws in the most commonly used airplane in the world, the Boeing 737. It had flaws in the tail rudder system that made the plane go out of control and caused a series of fatal crashes around the world, which Boeing initially blamed on pilot error and that we proved were a mechanical flaw. We uncovered tremendous fraud and abuse in a United States program that was supposed to house the poorest Native Americans, one of the most tragic stories in our country, and instead the money was going to build mansions for tribal officials at the expense of their constituents. We found that a shocking number of school bus drivers in Seattle had serious criminal and serious driving records. 1 out of every 9 school bus drivers was a criminal, convicted criminal, and was now driving little kids on a bus. We uncovered a legal loophole that legally allowed industries, particularly heavy manufacturing industries, to dispose of their toxic waste, including radioactive waste, and just call it fertilizer. They didn't even have to process it. They could just simply call it agricultural fertilizer. People were buying it, spreading it on fields. The crops were dying, people were getting sick, and it was all legal. We exposed a system where school sport coaches in junior high school and high school level, coaches, particularly of girls' teams, were sexually abusing their young players. They would get, when it was discovered, they would get fired, but then they were left free to go get the same job at another school district because the school officials just wanted it to go away quietly. They didn't want any lawsuits. They didn't want any publicity. So some of these guys would just go from district to district to district. It was called passing the trash, and we uncovered 159 cases like this. We revealed that at one of the world's most respected cancer research centers, a place called the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, patients were being put into high-risk clinical trials for a drug in which their doctors had a personal financial interest, and the patients weren't told about that, and they weren't told about the risk. And then finally, we uncovered that more than 2,000 patients in a state drug program had died of opioid overdoses, and the state hadn't even known about it. The state had not made the connections. We did data journalism in which we cross-tabbed people in the program with death records and discovered more than 2,000 deaths. So those are just some examples of what we have done and what we had done in Seattle, and a clue as to why David Boardman, who's the guru of solutions journalism, thought, boy, if we could convince these people that solutions journalism has merit, maybe we can get somewhere in credibility. So let's talk about investigative journalism first. Investigative reporting generally is about finding problems. You know, problems that most often somebody in power, whether it's in government or in business, is trying to keep from us. Sometimes, as in that last story, it's not that they were hiding it, it's that they didn't even realize it. So sometimes it's just finding problems that are beneath the surface that people in power don't know, shining a light on that problem. And the best investigations, they start at street level, they're grounded in data and documents, they begin with questions rather than with theories and hypotheses. They have a clear relevance, and they tell readers, viewers, something that somebody in power doesn't want them to know. And ultimately, they have an impact. The way they have an impact, according to investigative journalism's theory of change, is that these people are hiding bad deeds, or there's these insidious incremental problems. If we come along and we shine a spotlight on it, that people will be motivated to change things. The citizenry will call for reform, and our elected officials will respond. How many of you have ever had an experience where that didn't happen? Where you uncovered something, shone the light on some problem, and nothing ever happened? I have, many, many more times than these stories. That happens very commonly. And so that whole theory of change is based on this quote from Joseph Pulitzer. There's not a crime, there's not a vice which does not live in secrecy. Get these things out in the open, describe them, attack them, ridicule them, and sooner or later public opinion will sweep them away. Well, you know, we're seeing right now in my country very clearly that that's not the case. The details that have been revealed about my country's president and his activities, both personal, financial, otherwise, these are things that 20 years ago, 10 years ago, we would have thought, wow, that would drive somebody out of office. But the tolerance level in our society for these things is obviously quite a bit different. And that's the case, I think, at all levels of our culture. So certainly, investigative reporting is crucial, and we've seen many wrongs righted, lives saved, laws changed. But we've also seen, in many cases, inaction, and we've also seen this phenomenon, a dramatic drop in trust. Now, I'm not saying that there's a direct line from investigative reporting to the drop in trust, or at least not as the sole purpose or the sole motivation or the sole reason for that. But I do believe that there is a connection, and there's data that would indicate that. So we talk a lot. I've done three interviews today, and in every one, this question has come up of Donald Trump and President Zeman and others in this populist wave that we're seeing across the world, whether their attacks on the press have led to this loss of trust in the media. And I would say no. Look at that trend line. These are skilled politicians because they picked up on the public sentiment. They picked up on something that's been happening for 2 decades, and they capitalized on it. They didn't create it. Now, they've exacerbated it, I think, tremendously, but they didn't create this loss of trust. We see really clearly in the public this sense of helplessness, this sense of unrelenting negative news, unrelenting problems, unrelenting distrust in our institutions. A very clear sense of what some sociologists and journalism academics are calling news fatigue. And there was an Associated Press poll that found that this news fatigue had created in many of our readers what they called a learned helplessness response. Just a sense of, why should I read this? I can't do anything about it. And leading to a sense of wanting to tune out, especially when there are so many other choices out there of things you can tune into. You can binge watch, 1,000 different television channels, either on your TV or on the internet. There are so many things you can read, you can engage with. And news is increasingly something that a lot of people are tuning out. But that same poll found that when people think there's something that can be done about a problem, even if it's something small and relatively modest, they're much more receptive and attentive to the information. So you've seen in the U.S., and I know your figures are probably not dissimilar, although I think in some ways we may be maybe 5 years ahead in the economic decline of journalism. But this is the line of what's happened to U.S. advertising revenue. I know the numbers are small, but you only need to see what the curve looks like to get the point. This is circulation decline. This is employment at newspapers. It's worth thinking back in the United States to, we were the very first country that actually in which our founders actually called out journalism and the profession of being in the press in our founding documents, in the sense that it is the first statutory creation of a freedom of the press. And the author of that was Thomas Jefferson, who was ultimately our third president, who had no great love for the press at all. In fact, really despised many individual journalists, but had this famous quote, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or a newspaper without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." And then fast forward to the man, I guess, who probably owns this podium, and what he has to say about the press. The fake news media, failing New York Times, NBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN, is not my enemy. It's the enemy of the American people. Well, that's really profound and dangerous language. So, that's all I'll preface for. Okay, what about this thing called solutions journalism? Where does it come in and how can it help? I talked about the AP study. There was a BBC study of people, young adults under the age of 35, and it showed that about 2/3 of them wanted their news to not stop with identifying the problems, but to identify potential solutions to those problems. And it was the very top content request they had in an open-ended question. They didn't say, "Give me more entertainment news, give me more sports." They said, "Give me more potential solutions to problems." On that point of readers being more receptive, when I said people, as I said, when people feel there's something that can be done, there is empirical evidence that they're more attentive to the information. Sorry, this clicker isn't the best. This is really important information, I think, for journalists and for journalists, for the bosses of journalism and the business people. Study of 7,000 articles from the New York Times found that positive content is far more viral than negative content. That on social media, what you see, and this has been shown in several studies, is that negative sensational news tends to be shared on a big spike. It happens almost instantly. Everybody wants to be the first one to tell everybody else that something bad happened. And then it dies down, it falls off a cliff. So the sharing graph looks like this. It's a big up and a big down, and that's the end of it. So on solutions-oriented news, the line looks like this. It's a steady curve upward. It builds on itself, and it has a much longer tail, much longer life, and it's really a powerful phenomenon. Negative messages spread faster, but the positive messages reach many more people. So we talked about what the best investigative journalism is. What's the best solutions journalism? So it starts with problems that we already recognize. There are many things in our society and cultures where we know what the problems are, whether they're poverty, homelessness. In our country, there's a particular problem that we call the achievement gap, which is this just unrelenting gap between how students of color, particularly African American males, perform in schools and white people perform in schools. So there are many things where we understand what the problem is, and it's not enough to just identify the problem. Good solutions reporting is just as rigorous as great investigative reporting. It's grounded in data and documents and interviews in the same way that investigative reporting is. It explains the what and how of responses. It provides evidence of results, not just intentions. It's not about heroes and happy news. And it provides insights that can help others, not just the inspiration. It also discusses the limitations of potential solutions. If you are investigating solutions to family homelessness, you might go to another city that's dealt with this very effectively and find, well, that can work there because the price of land is very low there. But in Prague, that wouldn't work. The cost of housing is too expensive here. So, I mean, it really is the full real deal. It's the full scope of investigative reporting. And I think of it, and we who are excited about this, think of it as complete reporting. It's in the same tradition as investigative reporting, but it's more complete. It's taking it to the next step. It's just the next iteration, the next evolution of investigative reporting. So the theory of change for solutions journalism, again, is we already can identify some of the more durable, enduring, and damaging societal problems. We don't need to shine the light on those anymore. It's not enough to just uncover what's wrong and step away from it. Citizens need credible examples of effective responses to problems. And this is one of the key points, and it's the most dramatic argument that I make with investigative reporters, particularly those who are skeptical of this. It actually leads to more accountability of public officials, not less. Because one of the most common things you hear from public officials about problems is either, well, there's nothing we can do about that, or that's not the role of government, or we would need to raise taxes to do that, we don't have enough money to do that. And when you can point to other locations, other locales, other jurisdictions that have succeeded with the exact same problem, that creates accountability. A problem that previously might have seemed unavoidable or unaddressable now comes to be seen as unacceptable. how you can ferret out whether a topic is actually suited for solutions journalism. First of all, is there a lack of awareness about a problem? Then if there is a lack of awareness, then at least you might start with more traditional investigative journalism. If there's great awareness of the problem, then you're going down the solutions journalism path. Is there awareness but insufficient outrage about the problem? Well, if the answer is yes, then again, you might want first to go to a more traditional investigative approach earlier in the timeline of investigative journalism. If the answer is no, then again, solutions journalism might be the answer. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask the photographer to move this. I'm not going to. So one of the keys to in investigative journalism, particularly when it comes to data and statistics, we teach young journalists, we teach our students, you look at this data and you're looking for the negative deviance in the data. You're looking for the problem, you're looking for the worst performer, and that's the one you want to shine light on. That's where the story is. So in this case, this is a graph of people in the state of Pennsylvania who had been put on probation for crimes. And then when they were released, and once they were off probation, did they get a new conviction? And each one of those blue lines is a county, a jurisdiction, a sub-jurisdiction in the state of Pennsylvania. Well, where is the story in this? So down at this end, it's an almost 50% reoffending rate. And down at the low end, it's about a 15% rate. So where's the story? Traditionally, 9 out of 10 journalists at least would say, well, here's the story. Let's look at why is there such a problem in that county? And that is a story. Although if you look at it, there are a lot of counties in that realm. But yeah, that's a problem. Although if you look at it too, it's only about 10% above the mean. Solutions approach would be, there's the story. That is that's 25% below the mean. What's going on in that county that might be applicable to all of these other counties? And pointing out the problem in this county isn't going to help any of the other 38 counties. Exploring and investigating what's happening in that county might help all 38 of the other counties. Which is the better story? Probably the one on that end. Skip that one. Here, these are statistics from a hospital in New York on cesarean births and the percentage of operations, of pregnancies that are ultimately delivered by cesarean. Where's the story in this? Let's see. Confusing myself here for a minute. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. These are two different hospitals. They both have the same name, as it turns out. That's why I got confused for a second. All right. So the state average here is 34%. This hospital has a 49% rate of cesarean birth, and we assume that a high rate of cesarean is not a good thing. It's a more dangerous way to deliver. Tends to produce more revenue for hospitals. There are some hospitals that make an industry out of it. So it's 49% in this branch. It's 18% in this branch. They're probably both stories, but again, I would charge the one that's this much different than the mean is probably the better story, and there's probably more useful information to be had out of that one. And that's not something that we ever would have considered previously. We would have just ignored that. Where do we find ideas for solution stories? There are many in academic papers. The academic community has as a paradigm and as an approach, has been much more open to looking for effective means in medicine and science and biology and environmental news and economics and sociology, and there's lots of good potential stories there. As we learn to manage and manipulate big data, there's certainly a lot there. Social media. You find, we all know, everybody is happy on Facebook. Everybody's life is perfect on Facebook. Nobody shares how miserable they are. I have very few people who. I have one person who complains all the time on Facebook, but everybody else among my 1,000 Facebook friends is happy and has a perfect life. Well, in all that perfection, you're likely to find some interesting stories about good things happening. And government officials, actually, when they do achieve something, they like talking about it. This map, which you won't be able to see, but it just gives you some idea. These are just some of the places that have meaningfully embraced solutions journalism in the last 5 years in the United States. And I'll say, I look for a national version, an international version of this. We're working on a global map right now that we'll have soon. In fact, some of my colleagues are going to be here in a couple of months and they'll have a great global map. But there are more than 130 nations now have journalists who are doing serious solutions journalism practice. You can find a lot of those stories. There's a website, solutionsjournalism.org is the website for the network. And the real gold mine on that website is something called the Story Tracker. And on this Story Tracker, it has an amazing library of curated content. So this is not automated content. This is not some robot putting the stories there because they have the word solution in them. This is curated content on a variety of topics. And you can plug that topic in, and it's just an absolute gold mine with whatever you might be, any kind of social, governmental, cultural issue on which you might be reporting. And it's about 3,000 stories in there now. You can join something called the Hub and set it up so with keywords so that it will alert you to stories in areas of your interest. I'm going to just briefly talk about a few case studies here. This one is a great case in contrasting approaches to an issue. Both Chicago, Illinois, and the little town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, both had really shocking spikes in their murder rates. Much different numbers, of course, but similar percentage increases. Chicago took what is a very traditional approach to that, which is what I call the shock treatment. They just went into the neighborhood and they captured these tragic, horrendous stories of violence and pain and grief. It was good journalism. There was nothing wrong with it in terms of traditional journalism. It had powerful photography, powerful, sad stories. And in the long run, I have to guess, they probably lost a lot of readers, and most of their readers are white, suburban, upscale readers. Can't imagine that a lot of them stayed with this for very long. Fayetteville took a solutions approach to this, which is they had already reported extensively on the problem, and they went around the country, even though it's a small paper without a lot of resources, they went around the country and looked for approaches to decreasing violence and murder. In this case, here's an initiative in Atlanta on which they reported. Now again, just because something works in one location doesn't necessarily mean it'll work in another, but that's part of, that's where the journalism comes in. Minneapolis is the newspaper there is one of the national leaders in this approach. And they did reporting on a topic that I think has resonance certainly across much of Europe. And I know immigration issues are emerging as a point of contention here. Minneapolis has had a multi-generational Somali community, long-standing and very large. And in the past few years, they have had problems with some of their young people, some of the Somali young people, especially males, young males, becoming radicalized and then going to fight for ISIS and other radical Islamic groups. In the past, Minneapolis had covered that very much as they are a threat to us sort of story. Minneapolis, apart from this Somali community, is overwhelmingly white city, very well-standing, well-educated city. And the stories were very much us and them. The problem had been identified, as I said, it was this radicalization of youth, and then against that backdrop, the city's long-standing Somali community was really feeling threatened and ostracized from the rest of the community. And this was something the newspaper felt really needed to be addressed. So there were two prongs to this problem. There was why are these young men going off and what can be done about that? But then there's also, and in the meantime, it's creating this really horrendous cleft in our community. And then creating this cycle of hatred and fear. One of the most, so how did they address it? They sent reporters around the world, particularly found very valuable information in Denmark more than anywhere else about effective approaches to anti-extremism and how to keep these young people from being radicalized. And one of the ways they did that was most effective, I'm going to jump to the third bullet, well, I'm sorry. They set up listening posts to really try to understand the community. They hired a young Somali journalist. They took people into the community in ways that they hadn't. But one of the most important things they did was they changed the frame of the story, which in the past, as I said, had been very much they are leaving and they are threatening us. They are a danger to us. They said, you know, these people are a significant part of our community. Let's change the frame on this story to losing our children. These are our children. These aren't just their children. And that changed the whole dynamic. They decided to embrace this part of the community as their community, not just the Somali community. One of the things they did that was really effective is they went into this neighborhood, which frankly very few of the white community had felt invited or welcomed into, and they did some virtual reality 360 video that was really effective. Can we get that powered up here just to demonstrate?
This one?
Yeah, yep, that's it.
Capital of Somalia. It just has so much culture, so many stories. My name is Samaya Keenan, and this is my grandparents' store. I'm a business major, and I hopefully want to take over the family business. This shop right here, we
This is the
pretty much
Chrome
have
version,
everything,
because
the dollar store to clothing.
we're not getting the
now
360
we're doing
effect
a
here.
collection. It's like, it's a one-stop store for the locals.
Oh, okay, all right.
It's
Yeah,
not
you need to
only
draw
East
it.
Africans, it's now we have
There we go.
Americans, we have a lot of Europeans, we have a lot of tourists, and a lot of university.
Ethiopia.
Okay, we can go back.
People
So you get the
in
idea, but I
it's always-
mean, if you've never walked into this neighborhood, you know, this young Somali journalist that we've just hired at the Star Tribune is going to take you into her neighborhood. And you're going to feel safe and comfortable there, and you're going to feel welcome to next time actually go into it yourself. This is the bullet I just talked about, this changing the frame of the story. I won't play this one to save us some time, but this was a really effective video they did in social media, Facebook and Snapchat, and it was these young Somali women talking about what it was like when they go into these majority white high schools and as they're treated as terrorists, and the other students are pulling on the hijab, and just it's very interesting more personal approach to this problem. It really changed the community dialogue there tremendously. And I haven't, again, seen reflective data on this in the end, conclusive data, but there certainly was a sense that this radicalization was really starting to change and the community was coming together. In Seattle, before I left there, one of the last big projects I did was on the issue of public education. Seattle and Washington State is one of the wealthiest places in America. It has, really in the world, the two richest men in the world live in Seattle, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. It's a home of Microsoft, Amazon, Starbucks, Boeing, really a phenomenally wealthy place. And it has one of the worst public school systems in the country. Of all the 50 states in America, it was 47 in per student spending. Really a shockingly abysmal public education system. And one of the reasons for that is the community had become really polarized along the lines of pro-teachers union and anti-teachers union. That they held the teachers entirely responsible for this, and it was either the teachers don't have enough pay and enough resources, or it's that the teachers union controlled everything and they're unresponsive and they don't care about the kids. And so the community had become totally just ossified in their positions. They were polarized and they weren't talking to each other and nothing was getting done. And in the meantime, the students' test scores were just getting worse and worse, and a lot of responsible parents were just abandoning the public school system. So again, approached by David Boardman and the Solutions Journalism Network, we said, let's try to, this is a real tough nut to crack in Washington State. Let's see if we can take a solutions approach to this. Well, the first thing we did, and I want to underscore this for the journalists in the room, there's money to be had in this area. There are a lot of foundations that are looking to fund this journalism because they really see it as an effective vehicle for social change. And we were able to get a significant grant from the Gates Foundation through the Solutions Journalism Network. Initially $500,000 and ultimately $1 million. I mean, you can do a lot of great journalism for $1 million. And we were able to create a team of reporters and editors and even people like community engagement specialists with this money. We traveled the nation and the world to find fresh approaches to the problems that were facing education in Washington State. And ultimately, we changed the community conversation. This is an example on student discipline. We were finding, again, back to that issue of achievement gap, a lot of minority students, particularly black males, were getting suspended out of school in the first and second grades. And there were studies showing that when that happens, you might as well kiss those kids goodbye. You kick a first or second grade kid out of school for a disciplinary problem, right away it changes their whole paradigm, their whole view of school and their place in it. We looked at disciplinary approaches, again, around the country and around the world. We looked at studies that showed definitively that race skewed disciplinary practices, that the same behavior by a white kid and a black kid resulted in different discipline. And then we found a place that was dealing with disciplinary problems, and particularly truancy problems, and really dealing with it in an effective way. We discovered that intervention, counseling and other sorts of intervention programs were far more effective than discipline with troubled kids. We found small districts that were actually doing much better with this than the big, richer districts. And we created new vehicles for community engagement. So not only did we do stories in the newspaper and online, we engaged people from the community to write columns. We did live chats for the public with experts on school discipline or whatever the topic might be. We did video hangouts. We did a lot of live events, and those live events were, and continue to be, I have to tell you, just magical. Hundreds of people would show up in the public library to have a conversation about these issues. Hundreds. And they began angry. The first couple of these had high tempers and many of the same polarized approaches. And as we went on through the years, and this has been 5 years now, they've become much more nuanced, much more focused on how can we work together and address these problems. Did workshops working with the universities, dedicated Facebook group that's operated just on this education lab idea. So what were the impacts? I just picked one here. In September of the second year of the project, the school board declared a moratorium on suspensions for elementary school students, and that continues. No longer are students suspended. And then the next year, the state legislature passed a bill requiring districts and the courts to establish these community truancy boards where the local citizens would actually work with students to keep them out of court, out of jail, and back in school. This is, for many of the people in the room, probably just as important. Look at the impact on traffic and engagement of these stories. And these are solutions-oriented stories versus traditional education stories. The page views were 102% higher. The time on the page was 80% higher. The social sharing was 230% higher. And the returning people coming back to read more education lab stories, 64% higher. We surveyed the readers, 62% said the story changed the way I think about the topic. 50% of the parents and 84% of the educators said they were likely to talk about these stories with other people in the community. And 87% said they appreciated the focus on solutions rather than just problems. And then this was an unanticipated benefit that really surprised me. We found that local companies and corporations wanted to associate with this. Once this thing got traction and started to really be talked about in the community, one of the local companies, Alaska Airlines, which is a big West Coast airline in the US, headquartered in Seattle, they wanted to sponsor it. So they sponsor the coverage now. They've paid, I don't know what the amount is, but it's in the six figures to sponsor this coverage. It's been so successful that the Seattle Times has now taken it to other topic areas. So they have one that's called Transportation Lab, because transportation is a big issue in Seattle. And it has, I think, 10 corporate sponsors. They didn't get a grant for that, but they got 10 corporate sponsors. So it's part of the whole puzzle of the business model question for journalism as well. I wanted to mention briefly, there are 11 universities in the US that are now teaching solutions journalism. We're sort of the point of that, the ground zero. And our students have done remarkable work on the way it's taught. The way we teach it is not merely as a techniques class, but we teach it around a topic. And last year the topic was drug and alcohol addiction. The URL for this is coveringaddiction.com, and that tells the structure and technique of the class and has the syllabus. The work that the students actually produced, which I'm really proud of and I think you'll find powerful, is coveringaddiction.com/livingfree, one word, living free. That's what the project was called. And then finally, I wanted to show this is not just a United States phenomenon. As you probably have seen, The Guardian now is enthusiastically embracing solutions journalism. I hate what they call it. They call it the upside. And that to me sounds like happy news, positive news. There is a phenomenon in Europe. There's a whole movement around what's called constructive journalism. It has a lot of overlap with solutions journalism, and I respect the people who are running it, but the point of departure is they're much more about positive news And we never talk about positive news. That's really not what this is about. It's, again, we think of it as complete news, and that's a very different thing. So I'll end there, and I believe we're going to pick up with a conversation here and then take your questions, although